late afternoon, Conrad knew more about Tanner Nelson than he assumed Tanner knew about himself. This was thanks mainly to the avenues available to Wagner Aerospace, avenues not open to just anyone. Neither Zachary nor Conrad had any way of knowing why Tanner was in the cabin, but they were aware he had been close to Brandon Cheney, whom they long suspected had found something about the company that would best be kept buried. The only safe solution to Tanner's sudden interest in Zachary's affairs was to silence him once and for all, exactly as they had Brandon. Conrad had been lucky in finding Tanner the first place he looked. He knew Tanner held a lease on twin apartments, and since one of those apartments was lit and one was dark, it became obvious which one to check out. Conrad hadn't known for sure Tanner was inside until he opened the door. Seeing Tanner, he had instantly fired the dart. In retrospect, he realized he should have waited long enough for the tranquilizer to take effect before moving in. Tanner was a tough one, all right, but not tough enough to deal with Conrad Donahue. Holstering his gun, Conrad stepped to the window, where he pulled the shade and peered outside at the parking lot. Franco had already taken care of extinguishing the overhead lights and had pulled the Cadillac around to a point just feet from the apartment window. Conrad slid the window open just as Franco stepped up to it from the outside. No words were exchanged between the men, since both knew exactly what had to be done. Taking a couple of deep breaths to clear his mind from the effects of the drug, Conrad moved back to where Tanner lay. He emptied Tanner's pockets, placing everything inside a plastic bag to be disposed of later. Everything, that is, except for a ring of keys. Conrad had other uses for these keys, or at least one key he made certain was on the ring. This was the key to a Learjet belonging to Tanner's law firm, a jet that remained at Tanner's constant disposal. Conrad had seen the plane many times, as it was kept hangared at Falcon Field Airport, the same airport where Zachary kept his fleet of planes and choppers hangared. Conrad had a special reason for wanting the key. It would make commandeering the Learjet that much easier. Conrad dragged Tanner to the window, hoisted him up, and pushed him through to Franco on the outside. Franco dragged him the rest of the way to the Cadillac and shoved him inside the trunk. Conrad closed the window and walked back to the main lab, where he examined the computer he had seen Tanner standing in front of when he first entered the room. Glancing at the floor, he discovered the power cord had been unplugged. "Someone wanted to shut this computer down in a hurry, didn't they?" he reasoned aloud. "What do you suppose might be on the files inside it?" Removing all the cords, Conrad lifted the PC, which was no easy task in his half-drugged state. Somehow he made it out of the building, where he joined Franco. "It's not fair," Brandon shouted. "Everything was going perfect, Mitzi. Then these guys show up." Brandon kicked at the floor before revealing his next bit of information. "These are the same two guys who accosted me in Zachary Wagner's office." "What?" Mitzi gasped. "These are the men who murdered you?" "They are, and now they have Tanner in their net. A fine mess I've made of this assignment. I've solved nothing, and now I'm about to get Tanner killed." Mitzi placed a hand on Brandon's arm. "The authorities didn't send you on this assignment to have it end in failure, Brandon. They know what they're doing." "I know they know what they're doing. It's me I'm worried about. Have I dropped the ball, Mitzi?" "I don't have all the answers," she comforted. "But one little setback doesn't spell defeat. Tanner may be facing a problem, but I've seen him come through problems lots of times. And don't forget, he has two highly talented angels looking out for him." Brandon blew out a long breath as he watched the Cadillac pull out of the lot and make a right turn. "You really think he'll be okay, Mitzi?" he asked. "I really think so," she assured him. "Now, come on. We've got work to do." Conrad leaned back in his seat and pondered his next move as Franco pulled the Cadillac onto I-17 and headed for the airport. He hadn't shared the complete plan with Franco just yet, at least not the part about using the jet. But the jet was a perfect piece to the puzzle they were creating to hide the pending fate of Tanner Nelson. Franco would fly the unconscious Tanner to the island using the chopper exactly as planned. But Conrad wouldn't be along for that ride. He'd slip unnoticed into the hangar where the Learjet was kept and get it in the air under the guise of Tanner being at the controls. He'd fly it over the island, where he'd radio in a distress call saying he had engine trouble. Then he'd put the craft on autopilot, headed out to sea, and bail out over the island, where he would rejoin Franco in the chopper. The jet would run out of fuel and crash where it would never be found. The world would think Tanner was in the crash and had simply become shark food. It would be a nice touch to an already ingenious plan that had once worked with great success in the case of Brandon Cheney. Franco spoke, interrupting Conrad's thoughts. "What about the woman who was with Tanner at the cabin? What's Zachary's plan for her?" This was a question that had crossed Conrad's mind as well. "I don't really know what's in the old man's mind," Conrad responded, "but he doesn't want the woman touched. He calls her nothing but a pawn." Franco's eyes narrowed. "I don't like it," he growled. "Leaving loose ends is sloppy business." "I don't like it either, Franco, but the man who pays the bills wants it that way." Chapter 16. Vincent was proud of himself for the clever way he had nabbed Catherine from the clutches of his old rival tonight, and what a night it had turned out to be. It was wonderful having her home again. What was it about Catherine that set her apart from other women Vincent had known? She was beautiful. She was so much fun to be with. She was a woman who always seemed in control of herself, so in control of any situation she found herself in. She was just Catherine, and being just Catherine was what Vincent loved about her, and had loved about her since the very first day he ever laid eyes on her. He would gladly have given away every dime of his fortune to hear her say she loved him in return. But try as he might, he could never quite get her to care for him with the same depth he cared for her. Vincent wasn't blind enough not to know that Catherine's heart leaned toward Tanner, but he didn't care. Deep down he just knew it was he who could make Catherine happy, not Tanner. He had reasoned the game was over when Catherine moved to Australia, and he figured both he and Tanner had lost her love. At times he was tempted to pursue his interest in her, even though she had gone away. It would have been so easy for him to go to Australia, but he couldn't bring himself to do that. For as much as he loved her, he still put her happiness ahead of his own. If she had written even once, he would have been on her doorstep in a heartbeat. But she didn't write, and he took that to mean she wanted to take her life in a new direction. So he respected her wishes and didn't go to Australia. He was certain Tanner had reached the same conclusion, and it seemed they had become two casualties of love. But when Vincent learned Catherine had come home, and then that Tanner was already acing him out, the war was on again. He figured 8 years was a long time, long enough to change people. Maybe Catherine had changed enough for Vincent to stand a chance at besting Tanner this time around. He wasn't sure about that, but he was sure this had been a perfectly wonderful evening. He was sorry it was almost over. Pulling his Lexus into the apartment complex, he was concerned to see how dark it was. He already hated the idea of Catherine staying here in one of Tanner's apartments, but seeing this only heightened his concern. "Why is this lot so dark?" he asked. "I don't know," Catherine responded. "It wasn't this way last night." "Well, it's dark tonight," Vincent grumbled. "Doesn't say much for the maintenance around here." Vincent wasn't the only one wondering about the darkness. For some reason, the overhead light in the parking garage was out. Catherine was glad for her escort, since walking to the building alone was a somewhat frightening thought. Vincent got the door for her, and they stepped inside. "At least the lights in here work," he said, "but I'm seeing you to the door anyway." Her apartment was at the end of the hall, and reaching it meant going past the one Tanner was now using. As they drew near, she looked to see a sliver of light beneath his door. "Looks like Tanner made it home okay," she remarked. Vincent rolled his eyes. "Much as I hate the thought, I guess we should check on him." "You're going to have to face him sometime," Catherine teased. "It might as well be now." Vincent gave a couple of taps on the door. "My offer still stands for finding you a respectable place to stay," he said as they waited. "If you want to pick out a place yourself, my Lexus is available all day tomorrow, as am I." "We've already covered this, Vincent. Knock again. I don't think he heard you." Vincent knocked louder, but there was still no response. "The guy must be asleep," Vincent remarked. "Don't leave without checking Tanner's room," Mitzi urged Catherine. "And prepare yourself for a shock, lady. Things haven't gone very smooth here this evening." "Wait," Catherine said, digging through her purse for a set of keys. "Tanner had both of his apartments keyed the same. My key fits his door. I want to check on him." She handed the key to Vincent. "I can't go barging into a man's apartment, but you can." "Whatever," Vincent said, taking the key and unlocking the door. "But if I wake him, I hope he's not sleeping with a gun." He pushed the door open and glanced around. "Just an empty lab," he said, moving aside for Catherine to look. At first, everything seemed normal, until she looked where his computer had been. Rushing inside the room, she checked the loose cables. "What is it?" Vincent asked, following her. "Tanner's computer! It's been stolen! Something's terribly wrong, I know it!" Vincent's interest suddenly took an upswing. "The door to the bedroom," he exclaimed. "It looks like it's been forced open. This has all the marks of a burglary. But just to be sure," Vincent removed his cell phone and punched in a number. "Who are you calling?" Catherine asked. "I'm calling Corey. I want to know if he's heard from the officer he talked into pulling the gag on Tanner." "Yeah, Vince, this is Corey," came the immediate answer. "How'd it go, big man?" "We may have a problem. I'm in Tanner's apartment, and it looks like a burglar hit him. Did you hear from your friend Officer Blake?" "Yeah, Tanner turned the tables on him. Blake ended up giving Tanner an escort home." "Well, he's not here now. Call you back, Corey." Catherine knew she had to say something now. "There's something I haven't told you, Vincent. Tanner and I did more than just look at the outside of your father's cabin." Vincent looked puzzled. "You were inside the place? Why, Katie?" "It's a long story, and one I don't think you're going to like." Catherine was struggling for a way to break the news, and saying she and Tanner were acting on a tip from Brandon's ghost didn't seem appropriate, so she modified the facts some. "Tanner had received an anonymous tip about Brandon's murder," she said. "A tip that led him to your father's upstairs office at the cabin." A fiery look instantly filled Vincent's eyes. "Someone told Tanner that Brandon was murdered in my father's office? That's an outrageous accusation. I can't believe Tanner would put stock in such a thing. I can't believe it of you either, Katie." Catherine took both of Vincent's hands in her own. "We found traces of blood there," she said, "in a pattern Tanner says indicates a shooting." "No!" Vincent shouted. "If Tanner found blood, it was from something else. Brandon was not murdered in my father's office." "There's more," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Tanner found a computer disk hidden between the logs right where the blood indicated the shooting victim had fallen." "So what? My father constantly uses a computer in his office. Why couldn't a disk somehow have gotten where you say Tanner found one? I want this stopped now, Katie. I've got to find Tanner. What you're believing is all a bunch of lies aimed at discrediting my father." "I know you're upset, Vincent. I know how much you love your father, and I'm not saying your father is guilty of anything. What I am saying is the evidence points to someone shooting Brandon in that office. We don't know who, and that's why Tanner was bringing the evidence to his lab where he could run tests." "What kind of tests?" "Well, for one thing, he wanted to prove one way or the other if the blood he found was Brandon's. He wanted to check for fingerprints on the disc and learn what information was on it. We were trying to get here to his lab when your officer pulled Tanner over." Catherine paused for a breath, then went on. "You were right about your security men being on the job. They did detect us, Vincent. We avoided them by driving straight through the trees. Tanner said you used that way once to escape some girl's boyfriend." Vincent's face burned with anger. "You had no right snooping around my father's cabin. I can't explain the things you claim you found, but there's definitely something more going on than what he's concluded. Tanner is my best friend, but this time he's gone too far." "Check the floor behind this table," Mitzi whispered to Catherine. "If you look close, you can just make out the corner of a computer disk. The disk is important, Katie." Catherine lowered her eyes to the point where the table met the wall. "What's this?" she asked, seeing the corner of something that looked like a computer disk. She leaned down and retrieved it. "This is the same disk Tanner found at the cabin," she exclaimed excitedly. "Let me see that," Vincent said, yanking the disk from her hand. "Tanner kept a second computer in his other apartment. Is it still there?" "Yes, it's there. Let's go have a look at this." They moved quickly over to her apartment, where Vincent turned on the computer and inserted the disk. "Blast it!" he shouted, staring at the screen. "The disk is password protected." Vincent removed the disk and shoved it in his pocket. Catherine started to say something, but Vincent cut her off. "I refuse to leave you here, Katie. Grab whatever you need while I call Corey's sister Alexis. You can stay at her place for tonight at least." Catherine considered his suggestion. "You're sure Alexis won't mind?" she asked. "I'm positive. Alexis loves you, Katie. She'd never stand for me leaving you here under these circumstances." Vincent used his cell phone to make the call. Chapter 17. The first thing Tanner became aware of was the thumping noise of helicopter blades. He struggled to reason through the mental fog clouding his thoughts. The lab, a tranquilizer dart. He had punched out the intruder, jabbed him with his own dart, and locked himself inside the bedroom. Tanner raised his head to find he was in the back seat of a chopper. There wasn't much light, but enough for him to determine that he and the pilot were the only two on board. He strained to see the pilot. This wasn't the man who broke into Tanner's apartment. This man was balding, and what little hair he did have was mostly gray. The man at the apartment had a full head of black curly hair. Tanner suddenly remembered his shoes. Drawing a breath of relief that they had gone undetected, he tried to feel for them, only to discover his hands and feet were bound with duct tape. His hands were behind his back, so he reasoned if he could bend his knees just so, he might get a hand on one heel. It was a struggle, but he managed. He glanced out the chopper window and noticed a full moon. He knew it was just about midnight when the intruder entered his apartment. His best guess of the time now would be somewhere around 4 in the morning. He blinked, trying to focus his eyes. As he did, he noticed something in the faint light. It was a circular emblem embedded in the leather on the back of the pilot's seat. Tanner knew the emblem belonged to Wagner Aerospace. No big surprise there. But if this fellow at the controls thought he had an easy victim in tow, he was in for one big disappointment. Bending his knees again, Tanner maneuvered his hand for a solid grip on one heel. Once he had a secure hold, he gave a twist and felt it pull loose from the shoe. His next move would be a tricky one, and he had to be careful not to drop the shoe. He shifted his weight, placing himself in the best possible position. When he was sure he was at just the right angle, he rolled off the seat onto the floor. He had to get the heel jammed under the pilot's seat, where it would remain in place and not be seen. Considering the way they had him hog-tied, this was going to be difficult. Using his knees, he forced himself as close as possible to the back of the pilot's seat. He stretched his arms until the pain in his shoulders told him they were ready to slip from their sockets. Then he stretched 1 more inch. His fingers found a flap in the floor mat that might just do the trick. It took some doing, but he managed to get one edge of the heel under the flap. Then, using his thumb, he continued pushing against it until it was firmly wedged in place. This done, Tanner turned his attention to the duct tape. If he could find something sharp, he might be able to wear through it. He felt around until his fingers detected a protruding bolt. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Maneuvering to a point where he could get the greatest leverage, he began a sawing motion. Suddenly, he realized the chopper had started a steep descent, indicating they were about to land. He struggled all the harder with the tape, which he had now worn nearly halfway through. He felt the chopper touch down and heard the engine grind to a stop. The door opened, and he made out the figures of 2 men, one the pilot, and the other the intruder from his apartment. Tanner lay still, faking unconsciousness. He felt the men grab him, yanking him from the chopper onto what felt like the sands of a beach. This was instantly confirmed by the smell of salt and the sound of breaking waves. Wherever they had taken him, it was very near the ocean. Barely cracking his eyelids, Tanner checked out the men. This second one was definitely the man who accosted him in the apartment, which brought up an interesting point. How had the man gotten there if it wasn't in the chopper? The pilot spoke. "This guy won't be bothering us much longer, Conrad. Not after we introduce him to the cave that will be his new home." Cave, Tanner pondered. What could he mean by that? He assumed it wouldn't be long before he learned firsthand the answer to that question. At least he had a name for one man now. "Let's get this over with and get out of here," Conrad responded. Whatever their intention, they weren't going to be long about it. With 1 man on each of his arms, they dragged him some distance away from the chopper onto a rocky section of beach. "You watch him," the one called Conrad said. "I'll get the stone." Again, with slightly parted eyelids, Tanner watched as Conrad moved over to a large cylindrical-shaped stone. Putting his weight into it, Conrad gradually moved it to one side, revealing what appeared to be the entrance of a cave. Conrad returned, and together the men dragged Tanner over to the cave and shoved him inside. Seconds later, he heard the stone being rolled back into place. Realizing he was now out of their sight, Tanner sprang into action. He quickly found a sharp rock and finished cutting through the tape on his hands. Next, he freed his feet. It took only a moment to realize there would be no moving the stone from inside. It would be impossible to get enough leverage. This meant the exit was completely blocked. Tanner felt for his belt. "I see you boys missed this little item too," he said, twisting the buckle, which slipped off in his hand. Inside the buckle were 2 items, both of which Tanner needed at the moment. One was a miniature flashlight, the other a device Tanner had in mind for a special use. This one he slipped in his pocket for the time being. The flashlight he snapped on, as the only light inside the cave was the moonlight that weakly filtered in through the cracks of the entrance. As the beam of Tanner's light pierced the darkness of the cave, he could tell it extended some distance back. He began inching his way back, all the while checking for any possible way out. He had gone about 20 feet when he came to a small opening. It was too small for him to squeeze through, but large enough to afford a good view of the outside. What he first saw brought a start. Even at low tide, the waves were only inches below the opening. Reason told him that with the incoming tide, this whole cave would fill with ocean water. Not a pretty thought for someone trapped inside. Moving deeper into the cave, he discovered an upper ledge that seemed to be the highest point. The ledge was easily large enough to accommodate a man, which interested Tanner. If someone were inside this cave when it was filling with water, the ledge might have become a place for a last-ditch effort to remain alive. I wonder if these culprits have used this cave before, perhaps for the purpose of an execution chamber? Pulling himself up, Tanner shone the light over the surface of the ledge. Something white caught his eye. It was jammed between two rocks, so Tanner stretched out his arm and pulled it loose, examining it under the light. It was a skull, a human skull. "Looks like I was right," he observed. "I'm not the first visitor to this cave. You've been a very bad man, Zachary Wagner. It looks like I'm going to have to bring you down even if you are my best friend's father." Checking the shelf more closely, Tanner realized there were more bones, enough he estimated to make a complete skeleton. Then he spotted something else. Very carefully, he reached out and picked it up. "Oh no," he gasped, seeing it was a gold pocket watch. Running his thumb over the raised image of a telescope facing a star-filled sky, Tanner knew what he had found. This was Brandon's watch, the one given to him by his grandfather. Tanner swallowed and let out a muffled moan as he realized he had just uncovered Brandon's tomb. "This is how you died?" Mitzi asked, staring at his skull. "You make it sound more grim than it really was," Brandon quietly explained. "Not that I wasn't scared out of my wits, but you know the story, Mitzi. As the darkness closed in, it was replaced by streamers of brilliant light, and right there in the middle of that light stood a woman with a smile warm enough to conquer all my fears." "Who was she?" Mitzi asked. "My grandmother. And what a shock to see her looking younger and more beautiful than I ever remembered her." "Oh yes," Mitzi giggled. "How glad I was to learn that old is a stigma attached only to mortality. I never reached that stage in my own mortal life, but I would have hated it, believe me." "You died young too?" Brandon asked. "I was 30. A drunk driver ran a red light. One second I was driving along University Boulevard in Denver, Colorado, and the next I was looking into that same brilliant light. It was my grandfather who picked me up." She laughed. "He was also much younger than I remembered him." "You died in a car accident? Did it bother you looking at your own body?" "Of course it bothered me. I looked a mess, and there was nothing I could do about it." Brandon laughed. "You were worried about what some medic was going to think when he saw the condition of your hair?" "Yes, it still bothers me just thinking about it." "Yeah, well, it sort of bothers me seeing my own skull and bones, but not for the same reason. It's just eerie, that's all. I guess it was lucky I climbed up on that ledge, otherwise Tanner might not have found me. Or, that part of me." "I know what you meant, Brandon. It wasn't easy climbing up there. I had been shot, I was pretty weak." "Maybe you had some help. Your grandmother might have put in a word with the authorities." "That's probably right. I'll have to ask her the next time I see her." At that instant, the sound of the helicopter being started broke the stillness. "Oh no," Mitzi gasped. "Those guys are getting away. Come on, Brandon, do something." "Do what?" Brandon asked. "There's no way he can move that stone by himself, and we certainly can't help him. He's in the same fix I was in, and there was never a time in my whole mortal life when I was so helpless." "You forget I'm Tanner's guardian angel. I've seen him in tighter fixes than this. Not only that, I'm sure the authorities would never let things get this far without a way out. They're not going to doom your assignment to failure, Brandon, not because of something you have no control over." "I wish I were so optimistic, Mitzi, but if I couldn't find a way out, how can he?" Brandon looked over at Tanner, who had moved back to the opening, giving himself an unobstructed view of the ascending chopper. "Leaving so soon, fellas?" Tanner asked. "The party's just getting started." Mitzi gave Brandon a gentle nudge on the shoulder. "Told you so, didn't I?" she teased. "He has something up his sleeve. Just watch." Tanner pulled something from his pocket. "What's he got?" Brandon asked. "I'm not sure yet," Mitzi responded. "Whatever it is, it came from the compartment he had hidden in his belt buckle, the same as the flashlight." Brandon nodded. "I saw him take something out and stick it in his pocket. I think we're about to find out what it is." Holding the small device out the opening in the rocks, Tanner aimed it at the chopper. "Say hello to my friend Brandon," he said, pressing his thumb against a detonator switch. The report from the explosion was deafening. Being an angel, Brandon had no trouble moving outside, where he saw the chopper in a ball of flames and smoke. "Wow," he said to Mitzi, who was right behind him. "Tanner had a bomb. It must have been inside the heel of his shoe that he planted under the pilot's seat. And the object he had hidden in his belt buckle was some kind of remote detonator," Mitzi added. As the angels watched, the chopper fell in 2 sections. The front half, where both men had been, crashed into the ocean, disappearing beneath the rolling water. The rear half was thrown back toward land, falling at a point where the beach merged into a section of dense vegetation. "They never knew what hit them," Mitzi observed. "They messed with the wrong guy when they messed with Tanner Nilsson." "Who, by the way, is still trapped inside the cave," Brandon pointed out. The angels checked back inside to find Tanner at the stone blocking the exit. "You can't move it, buddy. It's too heavy," Brandon lamented. "He's not trying to move it," Mitzi said. "Look, he has another explosive." As Brandon watched in amazement, Tanner removed the heel from his second shoe and crammed it into a crevice between the stone and the solid rock wall. "He's going to blast his way out," Brandon exclaimed. "So it would seem," Mitzi agreed. "How far back does this cave extend?" "Far enough to keep him safe, just as long as he stays low and behind the cover of the rocks. But the sound of the explosion is going to give him one hummer of a headache." "I vote we don't hang around in here to verify that, Brandon." "Good point. Tanner's smart enough to take care of himself. We might as well wait outside." Chapter 18. The 2 angels emerged from the cave to an unexpected sight as Conrad Donahue stumbled from the water onto the beach. "What happened?" Conrad gasped, holding his head. "The chopper exploded. I don't get it." "Guess what we're about to witness," Brandon grinned. "This could be entertaining." "Could be," Mitzi agreed. "Since Tanner's okay for the moment, what do you say we kick back and watch?" "Sounds like a plan. Look, Franco is coming up behind his cohort. I think I'm going to enjoy this." "Look at that thing," Franco said, pointing to the section of broken chopper that landed on the beach. "How'd we come out alive?" "I don't know," Conrad responded. "My cell phone's gone. You still got yours?" Franco checked. "No, I've lost mine too. How are we going to get off this rock with no transportation and no communication?" "Wagner will send someone looking for us." "I can't figure out what happened. The chopper seemed fine, then it just blew. I've been flying those things for years and never experienced anything like that." Brandon and Mitzi watched as the figure of a third man walked up the beach to where they stood. "Morning, Brandon, Mitzi," the fellow said as he approached. "Morning, Gabe," Brandon returned. "Out for a trash pickup this early, are you?" "It's a dirty job, but some angel has to do it." Both Brandon and Mitzi were acquainted with Gabe. They knew he was from the lower side greeting department, here to escort Conrad and Franco to their new facility. Unlike the sort of greeting Brandon and Mitzi received when they stepped from mortality, Conrad and Franco's kind rated a different reception. No grandmother, no grandfather, no special friend, just someone from the lower side greeting department. "If you two will excuse me a minute," Gabe said, "I'll get this pickup started." Neither man had noticed Gabe until he stepped up behind them. "Excuse me, gentlemen, might I have a word with you?" Both men whirled to see who had spoken. "Who are you?" Conrad demanded, searching frantically for his gun that seemed to be missing. "Interesting question," Gabe responded. "Who were you expecting exactly? Your friendly neighborhood welcome wagon?" "Your gun!" Conrad barked at Franco. "Give it to me." "I don't have it. I must have lost it in the crash." Gabe raised a hand, trying to ease the tension. "It's okay, boys. You won't be needing guns where you're going." "Who are you?" Conrad demanded a second time. "Name's Gabe. I'm your transportation off this rock." Conrad did a double take. "Do you work for Wagner?" "Oh, no. I report to someone much higher than Zachary Wagner. Now, if you gentlemen are ready, can we get started?" "I'm not going anywhere," Conrad snapped. "Not without some answers. Who do you work for, and where is it you want to take us?" Gabe let out a lingering sigh. "You fellas haven't figured it out yet, have you?" "Figured out what?" Franco cut in. Gabe paused a moment, just looking at them. "You were in a helicopter crash, gentlemen, a horrendous one." "So tell me something I don't know," Conrad rebutted. "We survived a crash, so what? That still doesn't explain this little game of yours." Gabe motioned for Brandon and Mitzi to join him. Until now, they hadn't been noticed. "I'd like you fellows to meet a couple of friends of mine," Gabe said as the two stepped up. "The pretty one is Mitzi Palmer. The other one is someone I suspect you fellows know." "It can't be!" Franco shrieked, pulling back a step and searching again for his missing gun. "You're dead!" "No," Conrad said, keeping a much cooler head. "This can't be who you think it is, Franco. He's just a look-alike." Conrad raised a finger, which he waved in Gabe's face. "I want some answers, and I want them now. What are you doing on this island? And what's this thing about you being our transportation out of here?" At that instant, a flash of lightning bolted from the sky, striking at a point between Conrad's feet. Fire and sparks flew as the boom of thunder shook the ground. Conrad screamed and jerked back. "Sorry about that," Gabe said. "Sometimes I lose it when I get a finger in my face. Nothing I know agitates me quite like that." Gabe stepped forward and stood looking into the eyes of the shaken man. "Fine morning for a pickup, wouldn't you say? The sun will be breaking through any minute now. Ever seen a sunrise over this island? It can be breathtaking." Gabe glanced over at Franco, then back at Conrad. "Now, let me explain something to you gentlemen as plainly as I know how. You're both dead. As in expired, passed away, deceased. Anyway you cut it, the book just closed on your time in this world. So, you see, when I said I'm your transportation off this rock, I didn't mean back to Arizona." A look of horror filled the face of both men. "I can't be dead," Conrad exclaimed, patting himself down. "I don't feel any different." "You're not supposed to feel different," Gabe explained. "That's the way it works. And by the way, I just finished looking over the pickup papers for the two of you. You should be ashamed. You both did some naughty things in mortality. Pity. But there'll be plenty of time for you to think about that after I drop you off." "Uh-oh, Mitzi," Brandon spoke up. "Cover your ears. It's about to happen." The explosion caught only Conrad and Franco by surprise. The others were ready for it. "What was that?" Conrad cried. Brandon stepped forward. "That was my friend Tanner Nelson making pebbles out of the stone you had covering the cave entrance. You may have sentenced me to an untimely drowning, but you couldn't outdo Tanner." Conrad slunk back. "It really is you," he gasped. "It's him," Mitzi affirmed. "Looks a lot better than the last time you saw him, doesn't he?" Gabe spoke up again. "I'd like to stay here and chat some more, but I'm on a busy schedule. Come on, gentlemen, it's time. And don't make me use any more lightning bolts. That sort of thing gets a little dramatic." Chapter 19. Stepping through his newly created doorway, Tanner gulped in several breaths of clean air. He glanced up to see the sun just now breaking through the morning sky. "Okay," he said. "Now the question is, where exactly am I? It's a deserted beach, that much is obvious. The problem is finding what part of the planet the beach is on." He knew it had to be somewhere fairly remote in order for Brandon's body to have gone unnoticed the past 8 years. Shading his eyes, he checked the position of the sun, and suddenly realized that either the sun was rising in the west, or the ocean was to his east. He had assumed he was someplace on the Pacific coast, but that theory had just died. How could the sun possibly rise over the west coast? "I'm on an island," he reasoned. "There's no other explanation." He could see that this island, if that's what it was made up of a mountain, a beach area, and a densely vegetated rainforest. The mountain was off to his left where the cave was situated, the beach was to his right, and the rainforest was inland beginning about 100 feet back from the surf. What he wanted now was to look things over from the highest point. He did a visual check of the small mountain. It appeared climbable, but only with some difficulty since it was a highly rocky terrain. "Might as well get started," he said. "Just looking at it won't get the job done." The climb didn't prove to be as bad as he had expected. He reached the top in about 20 minutes, and from there he could tell for sure he was on an island, albeit a small one, probably no more than 1.5 miles across at the widest point. Just as he expected, there were no signs of habitation. Tanner moved over and knelt down next to a pool of water. Scooping up a handful, he found it sweet to the taste. Rainwater, he calculated. From the amount of vegetation here, it's apparent the rainfall has to be heavy. He drank his fill. Next, he moved to a point where the beach below him was visible, noticing the downed section of the chopper, something he had overlooked before. Since it had fallen at a point where the beach and the rainforest came together, it was partially obscured by the undergrowth. Looking farther up the beach, he spotted something else of interest. A parachute, he mused. An old military camouflage chute. Haven't seen one of those around in a while. The parachute might explain how Conrad got onto the island without being in the chopper. But why would he have parachuted here? I must be missing something somewhere. Satisfied he had seen all he could from this point, Tanner started back down. Once he reached the beach, he headed straight for the wreckage. It's only the rear section, he noted. The front must have been ripped off in the explosion, probably fell in the ocean. I wonder if anything usable might be left in this mess. He moved closer. Well, what do we have here? He said, checking what had been a storage compartment. A toolbox, that might come in handy. Tanner pulled the box out and placed it next to the trunk of a nearby palm tree. Next, he found a 50-foot length of nylon rope and a half-used roll of duct tape. These he placed next to the toolbox. A continued search turned up something of special interest, a mobile phone built into one of the armrests. The phone itself seemed undamaged, but it lacked one thing. It had received power from the chopper's battery, which had been wiped out in the crash. Without power, the phone was useless. Tanner set it with the other items anyway. There was still one item he wanted to check out, the black box designed to transmit a locator signal upon impact. In all probability, the black box was transmitting its signal even now, which could be good or bad. There was no doubt the explosion had happened too fast for the chopper pilot to send out a distress call, so the first indication of a problem wouldn't come until the chopper was late returning to base. Even then, no one outside Zachary's organization would know, and those within the company wouldn't want anyone snooping around this island, not with the secret they knew lay hidden here. Even if they did report a chopper down, they certainly wouldn't give any hint it might be in this area. If anyone did come checking, it would be Zachary's men. It therefore became an advantage for Tanner to silence the black box. Why lead the enemy right to his door? Finding the black box and disabling it had a second advantage too. It would mean saving the battery for some future time when a signal might become helpful. Locating the black box was easy, and so was removing it, thanks to the tools he had found. He opened it carefully so as not to disrupt its usability later on, and simply disconnected the battery leads to shut it off. One important job remained. When Zachary's men did come looking for the downed chopper, Tanner wanted them to think it crashed somewhere out in the ocean, not here on the island. He knew the wreckage wasn't all that detectable from land, but it could be spotted without too much problem from the air. What he needed was a way to camouflage the wreckage, and what better way to do it than with an old military camouflage parachute? Chapter 20. Mel Phillips leaned back in his desk chair and glanced through his office window at a hangar filled with aircraft. To Mel, there was nothing more beautiful than discovering freedom beyond each new cloud. Acquiring the job as maintenance director, overseeing the fleet of Wagner Aerospace's airborne transportation, was a dream come true for Mel. Even now, 15 years into the job, Mel wouldn't trade places with any man alive. Not that the job didn't have its downside, such as Mel's lack of trust and respect for the company's founder. Mel always suspected that Zachary Wagner conducted his share of shady deals, but Mel figured since he was concerned only with the aircraft, the rest of what the company did was none of his business. As Mel watched the maintenance crew at work, he noticed a man wearing a dark business suit and carrying a briefcase step inside the hangar. Mel recognized him as Winston Harmon, a top company executive and the man Mel reported to directly. "Good morning," Mel said as Winston stepped into his office. "What can I do for you?" It was always obvious how out of place Winston felt inside the hangar office. He was most certainly a man accustomed to finer surroundings. Normally, all business conducted between these two men was done by phone. "I just got the word from the man that Conrad and Franco might be in trouble," Winston responded. "They took one of the choppers out on an assignment, and they haven't reported in. It's been several hours." Mel had noticed one of the choppers missing when he showed up for work, but he thought little of it, since it was common for the company pilots to take an aircraft out without telling him. "Are you hinting at a possible craft down?" Mel asked. Winston nodded. "There is some concern. The man would like it checked out." Hearing Winston refer to Zachary as the man always bugged Mel. There was just something sinister in it. But who was he to argue with Winston? "Have you reported this to the FAA?" Mel asked. "No. We have a touchy situation here. The man wants it handled in-house." This didn't sound good to Mel, but neither did it surprise him. It was just the way Zachary Wagner worked sometimes. "I know someone took number 7 out, but they didn't bother filling me in on a flight plan," Mel explained. "Which is nothing unusual. It happens all the time. But if I'm to conduct a search, I'll need to know where to start looking." "They were flying on an assignment over Butterfield Island," Winston responded. "That's all you need to know." Butterfield Island was a company code name for a small island just off the coast of Mexico, where Wagner Aerospace reportedly conducted some highly secretive experiments. The only reason Mel knew of the island came by accident when he happened onto a map showing its location. The map was one Conrad had inadvertently left inside the chopper after returning from a job several years earlier. When Mel mentioned the map and the island to Winston, he was told of its secret nature and sworn to silence on the subject. "I'll need to see the map showing the location of the island," Mel proposed now. "I only saw it once, and that was years ago." Winston removed a copy of the map from his briefcase and handed it to Mel. "Don't show this to anyone, and I want it back as soon as your search is finished." "I take it you want me to conduct this search personally?" "That's the way the man wants it. And regardless of what you find, you report back to no one but me. Is that understood?" Mel considered this. "What if I find them in need of help? In a life raft or—" "Regardless of what you may find, you report only to me," Winston said again. "What we're dealing with here is of the utmost sensitivity." "All right, Mr. Harmon. I'll do as you say." Mel had learned long ago to play the game with Winston. If he hadn't, he strongly suspected he would have been out of the best job he'd ever stand the chance of holding down. "Good," Winston stated shortly. "Naturally, I want you to check the water between here and the island, but I also want you to check the island itself." "I'll use one of the choppers," Mel suggested. "That way I can land if I do spot something on the island." "No, take one of the jets. That'll speed up your search. If a rescue is necessary, we'll handle it when the time comes. And do not, I repeat, do not use the radio to pass along anything you find. If you do run into something of interest, call in with the message, 'I'm on my way home with the groceries.' I'll know what you mean, and I'll be waiting here when you land. If you don't spot anything of interest, just hold your silence." Winston closed his briefcase and asked, "Any questions?" "I think I have it down," Mel answered. "Good. Then get to it. And remember, this is a highly sensitive mission. Don't foul it up." Chapter 21. "Sorry to rush off like this," Alexis apologized as she stepped out the door. "I should have been at the hospital 10 minutes ago. All part of the game in a nurse's life. I have no idea how late I'll be, so just make yourself at home. I'm sure Vincent will check on you sometime this morning." Catherine remained standing at the open door until Alexis's little Volkswagen Cabrio pulled out of the driveway. Try as she might, she couldn't get thoughts of Tanner out of her mind. It just didn't make sense, his running off the way he did without one word, and leaving that computer disk where he did, between his table and the wall. Why would he do that when the disk was such a strong piece of evidence for solving the mystery of what happened to Brandon? It just didn't add up. Catherine had only been back in the house a short time when the doorbell rang. "Vincent!" she gasped, opening the door. "Thank goodness it's you." "Bad night?" Vincent guessed. "It was a bad night, actually. Any word about Tanner?" Vincent pulled Catherine to his chest, where he held her for several seconds. "I just heard from Corey," he said at last. "There's been a breaking news bulletin. The pilot of a Learjet radioed in from a location somewhere off the coast of Mexico. He reported engine trouble just before the transmission went dead. The pilot identified himself, Katie. It was Tanner. There's been no sign at all of a wreckage. You know Tanner as well as I do. He's probably out there in a rubber life raft catching some rays." Catherine pulled away and buried her face in both hands. This just wasn't fair. A whole new world had opened when Tanner stepped back into her life, and now that world was shattering before her very eyes. "Where's Corey's sister?" Vincent asked. "She was called to the hospital on an emergency. Something about a 5-car pileup on I-10. You didn't miss her by 5 minutes. Vincent placed a hand on Catherine's arm. "I don't want you alone, Katie. I had a business flight scheduled to Puerto Rico, but I asked to have someone else send in my place." "Thank you," she choked out. "I really don't want to be alone, but I just can't understand. Tanner was onto something he felt was very big. There's no way he would have gone off on some job without a word of explanation. It doesn't add up." "It does add up, Katie, with Tanner. His job is his life. The distress call proves he was headed somewhere in the company jet." Catherine wasn't buying it, but she was in no mood to argue. She did have one question that needed to be asked, though. "What did you do with the disk we found in Tanner's lab?" "I spent a couple of hours last night trying to crack the password. I'm just not that computer savvy. This morning I put the disk in the hands of an expert." "You what? How could you, Vincent? That disk may contain information about Brandon's fate." Vincent shook this off. "I'm positive the disk has nothing to do with Brandon. I have no idea why there would be bloodstains in my father's office, but I know whatever the explanation, it's perfectly innocent. I gave the disk to Cecil Romero, the head of our computer department. If anyone can crack the password, it'll be Cecil." "You had no right," Catherine rebuked. "I don't care if you're trying to protect your father. That disk should be placed in the hands of the authorities. If, as you say, it had no incriminating information on it, then it would have gone for naught. I'm begging you, Vincent, get that disk back now." "Katie, the disk is perfectly safe in Cecil's hands. But if it means that much to you, I'll get it back. I'll have him make a copy of it." "You'll get it back from him when?" "Today, I promise. Have you had breakfast?" "I had some orange juice. I'm really not in the mood for food." "You've got to eat, Katie. You won't be any help to Tanner or anyone else if you don't keep up your strength. Grab your purse and come on. We're going to get you some breakfast." Tanner moved back a step to evaluate his efforts at camouflaging the chopper. It would do nicely. Only the closest inspection would possibly reveal anything out of the ordinary from the air. He had just finished the job when the sound of a jet abruptly reached his ears. Seconds later, the craft came into view. It proved to be a Learjet, similar to the one Tanner flew for his company. "That'll be some of Zachary's bunch now," he said, crouching low behind a cluster of palm trees. "I'm surprised it's a jet and not a chopper. No threat of them landing that thing here, but if they learn this is where those two dupes bought the farm, they'll be back." The jet made a pass over the island so close Tanner could nearly count the rivets on the fuselage. It was one of Wagner's. Tanner remained low, figuring the pilot would make a second pass before heading out. And he was right. This second flyover came from the opposite direction. Tanner now reasoned one of two things would follow. If the pilot had seen anything that caught his attention, anything at all, he'd make another pass. Or if Tanner's disguise had worked, and the pilot had seen nothing, then he'd most likely set a course back for the mainland and continue searching for traces in the water. Tanner held his breath and watched. To his great relief, the plane never turned. It soon became nothing more than a dot against the deep blue sky and then vanished altogether. When Mel failed to see any sign of the missing chopper on Butterfield Island, his natural instinct was to notify the FAA of a possible downed craft. If Conrad and Franco had gone down over water, their only real chance for survival would depend on a concentrated effort by the Coast Guard, who were equipped with all the proper resources. What chance did one man in a company jet have of finding them? Notifying the FAA was the right thing to do, but it would cost Mel his job, this he knew. It was the hardest decision of his life, but in the end, he kept the radio silence Winston had ordered and set a course for Falcon Field. After landing and before securing the aircraft, Mel set out to call Winston on one of the highly secure in-house phones. He knew that using a cell phone would be strictly out of the question. Mel punched in the number for Winston's office and breathed a relieved sigh when Winston picked up. If Winston had been out of his office, all Mel could have done was leave a message, and this was no time for leaving messages, with the lives of two men possibly at stake. "I combed the area between here and the island," Mel explained, "and I made 2 low-level passes over the island itself. I don't suppose there's been any word since we spoke." "You're saying you found nothing?" Winston barked. "No, not a trace. What else do you want me to do, Mr. Harmon? Should I contact the FAA yet?" "No." "I'll take it from here." The line went dead. For more than a minute, Mel stood staring at the phone, toying with the idea of making that call to the FAA. How could he ever look himself in the mirror again if those men should die because he did nothing? Picking up a picture of his wife and 2 daughters, he ran a finger over the glass. Thanks to his lucrative job, they lived very comfortably in a beautiful Paradise Valley home, and money for the girls' education would be there when the time came. He wet his lips, then slowly returned to the hangar to secure the jet. Chapter 22. Anger burned in Winston's mind at thoughts of having to bring a fool like Mel Phillips in on something this serious. Unfortunately, the only pilots Winston could trust were the 2 missing in the presumed crash, Conrad and Franco. The only choice he had, other than Phillips or one of the regular pilots, would have been flying the reconnaissance mission himself. That was an option he preferred not to consider, as it had been years since he had piloted a chopper. He couldn't help but feel edgy about revealing to Mel the things he had, and he certainly didn't want to let him in on anything more. Winston was aware of Conrad's plan to commandeer Tanner's Learjet and send the distress call in Tanner's name. He also knew the distress call had been picked up, and a search for the jet Tanner was supposedly flying was underway. Fortunately, this search was taking place farther out to sea than Butterfield Island, meaning the chances of anyone happening onto the chopper crash were extremely slim. Winston also knew that if Conrad had successfully made the phony distress call, he had to have been alive when the time came for him to bail out over the island. The logical conclusion was that Conrad and Franco met up on the island, did the job they set out to do, and met with an unseen tragedy on the way back to Falcon Field. They may have crashed on land, but that was less likely than the ocean. A crash on land would come closer to having been reported. The loss of two men such as Conrad and Franco was certainly a blow to Wagner Aerospace. But in this line of business there were always risks. The mission they were sent to do was absolutely necessary. Tanner Nelson had to be taken care of. He knew too much, evidenced by what the computer department had found on the hard drive of Tanner's computer. That, as well as the recovered floppy disk. It was really ironic the way that computer disk found its way home after lying hidden right under their noses all these years. To think Brandon Chaney had managed to hide it completely unobserved. In a way, Tanner's curiosity paid off in big dividends for Wagner. Granted, if Tanner had gotten away with his intentions, Wagner Aerospace would have been in hot water, but thanks to Conrad's quick action, everything was now back in check. Both the disk and the information Tanner had transferred to his lab computer wound up in Cecil Romero's hands and had now been totally obliterated. What Tanner had actually managed to do was eliminate all chance of that disk ever surfacing. Winston picked up the security phone again. It was time to fill Zachary in on this latest information. Winston had hesitated this long because he knew how Zachary would feel about having to take action against Catherine Dalton, but it was obvious she now knew more about the contents on the disk than Zachary could safely overlook. He'd have to reconsider his opinion of her as being only a pawn. The situation called for dealing with her and doing it swiftly. He punched in Zachary's private number and waited for the man to pick up. "Thanks for breakfast," Catherine told Vincent as they left the restaurant on their way to the parking lot. "I didn't think I was hungry, but those eggs tasted pretty good. Like I said, you have to keep up your strength. I was wondering if you'd like to stop by the radio station to see if Corey might have learned anything more." "That sounds as good as anything right now. I've never felt more helpless in my life." Vincent opened the door and Catherine slid inside. She pulled out a tissue and dabbed her eyes. Just as he closed her door, she felt a painful sting in her left shoulder. Jerking her head around, she was astounded to see a man in a dark suit behind her, holding a hypodermic needle he had unmistakably just used to inject her with something. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. Her tongue felt swollen, and her mind whirled dizzily. She glanced at Vincent, but her vision was too blurred to make out his expression. Was he a part of what was happening? Was Tanner really missing in a plane, or was this a trumped-up story used to distract her long enough for her to fall through a trap door? One final thought passed through her mind. Am I about to meet the same fate as Brandon? Then there was only darkness. "Come on, Brandon," Mitzi pleaded as she watched him pace back and forth outside Vincent's Lexus. "Things will work out. Don't give up the ship before the cannons are even loaded." Brandon threw up both arms. "I made a mistake, Mitzi. I thought if Catherine found the computer disk, it would be a home run for our side. I should never have asked you to whisper the location of the disk to her. Now look what's happened." Mitzi placed both hands on her hips. "Where's your faith?" she scolded. "So you didn't get your home run. It's not the 9th inning yet." "Not the 9th inning? How do you figure? Tanner's wandering around on a rock in the ocean while the whole world thinks he was killed in a plane crash. The evidence I saved on that disk that might have brought Zachary Wagner down has been eradicated. Catherine's life has just fallen squarely into the hands of Wagner Aerospace. What else could you call it but the 9th inning, Mitzi?" "Okay, so maybe it is the 9th inning, but there are still 3 outs to go. We're going to win this game, Brandon. I know how the authorities work, and I know they wouldn't have sent you on this assignment unless they were sure you were the right one for the job. Now get a hold of yourself. We have work to do." Chapter 23. An idea crossed Tanner's mind. The locator device he had salvaged from the chopper contained a battery the same voltage as the chopper battery that was destroyed in the crash. He could use this battery to power the mobile phone he had also salvaged. The battery wasn't up to full potential, since the device had been emitting its signal quite a while before he disconnected it, but with any luck he might get one call out. He quickly went to work changing out the battery. He knew exactly who to call. It had been a long, hard shift for Corey, one that had required a lot of effort to keep sounding upbeat in spite of all that was on his mind. He had just ended a commercial and signaled his engineer to start the next CD when the vibrator on his cell phone caught his attention. Who could it be? Corey was careful about who he gave out this number to. He concluded that whoever it was, they could wait. "Corey Harper, don't you dare ignore this call," Mitzi yelled in his ear. "Answer that phone or you'll have one irate lady angel to deal with. And I happen to be on a first-name basis with your guardian angel, so I can make good on my promise." Brandon did a double take. "I never heard you give a suggestion quite that strong, Mitzi." "Well, you have now," she said through a beaming smile. "And look, it worked. He's answering Tanner's call." "Yeah, Corey Harper here." "Corey, thank heavens you answered. It's me, Tanner." "Tanner! But I thought, weren't you in a plane crash?" "Plane crash? I don't know what you're talking about. Listen carefully to what I'm about to say because this phone could cut out any minute." "Shoot, buddy." "I was hit with a tranquilizer dart while working in my lab last night. I woke up in a chopper that landed on a small island somewhere off the coast of Mexico, I'd guess." "You'd guess? You don't know?" "No. And I'm using a mobile phone that can't be traced without special equipment. Zachary Wagner is at the bottom of this. I found the proof, and I found proof he killed Brandon. In fact, I found Brandon's body." "This is heavy stuff. I talked with Catherine earlier. She told me about what you found at the cabin." "Good. Then you'll understand when I tell you that it was Brandon's blood and fingerprints on the disc. Not only that, what was on the disc is enough to put Zachary Wagner away for the rest of his life. I'm afraid for Katie's life, Corey. Find her and make sure she's somewhere safe, and above all, keep Vince away from her." "You think Vince is one of them?" "I'm not sure, but don't take any chances. I outsmarted the two dupes who brought me here. They won't be showing up for dinner tonight." "Listen, Tanner, the world thinks you crashed your company jet somewhere in the ocean. You reportedly called in a distress call, then disappeared. That could explain why Conrad parachuted to the island. I'll explain that later. Can you get your hands on a map showing small uninhabited islands off the coast of the States and Mexico?" "Can do, buddy. Hang in there." The answer came only as a garbled and indiscernible noise. "Hello, Tanner?" Corey shouted into the phone. "Are you still there?" This time, there was no answer at all. Rushing from the sound studio and into the engineer's quarters, Corey shouted his intentions. "I have a big problem, buddy. Find a way to cover for me, okay?" "You're covered, Corey," the engineer responded without the slightest hesitation. "But you owe me big time." Corey burst through the door and headed straight to his car. He'd head for Alexis's house, since that's where he figured Catherine to be. He tried calling ahead, with no luck. All he got was Alexis's answering machine. Next, he tried the hospital, where the receptionist informed him Alexis was working in the emergency room. "I've got to talk to her," Corey insisted. "Tell her it's her brother." "It'll take me a minute or two," the receptionist said. "I'll wait, but hurry every chance you get." Not knowing where else to head, Corey changed direction with the idea of going to his own house. He had traveled barely 3 blocks when Alexis's voice came on the line. "What is it, Corey? I'm really tied up right now." "Catherine could be in big trouble," Corey shot back. "Do you have any idea where she might be?" "She was at home when I left for work. That's all I know. What kind of trouble?" "I'll fill you in later. Right now I have a lot to do, but if you hear anything from her, call me fast, okay?" "Wait," his sister shouted. "As I was driving away, I saw Vincent's Lexus headed for the apartment. He'll probably know where she is." "Oh, great," Corey mumbled. "Thanks, Alexis. I'll get back when I know something." Corey remembered he was the one who told Vincent about Tanner's supposed plane crash. What had he done? He had sent a possible killer right to Catherine's doorstep. "The Village Inn restaurant on Northern Avenue," Mitzi instructed, "and get there as fast as you can." "Village Inn?" Corey queried aloud. "This is no time to be thinking about food." "Listen to me, Corey," Mitzi continued. "That restaurant is important for more reasons than food right now. Drive by it, and you'll find out for yourself why." "Why am I hearing voices directing me to the Village Inn?" Corey asked himself. Then, remembering how a voice seemed to direct him to answer Tanner's phone call, he changed direction and headed for Northern Avenue. Once he came to the parking lot entrance, he turned in. A black Lexus SC430 caught his eye. "That's Vince's car," he gasped. Corey pulled into the spot next to the Lexus. What he saw inside brought a start. It was Vincent, and he was slumped over in the front seat. Corey yanked the door open. Grabbing Vincent by the shoulders, Corey shook him hard. "You're not just asleep," Corey stated as the realization set in. "You've been drugged, Vince." Corey gave him a vigorous slap. "Wake up, man!" "Wah!" Vincent mumbled, trying to open his eyes. Corey shook him again. "Snap out of it, Vince!" "Ooh," Vincent complained. "Who hit me?" "You've been drugged. Fight it, Vince. You've got to wake up." "Corey, is that you?" "It's me, Vince. Catherine is in trouble, and you may be the only one who can help her." The mention of Catherine apparently triggered something in Vincent's foggy mind. His eyes rolled into a fixed focus, staring straight at Corey's face. "Katie," he mumbled. "Winston drugged Katie. When I tried to stop him, he jabbed me with a needle." Corey could only wonder if this was all just an act of a guilty man trying to cover the truth, or if it was genuine concern. Regardless of his feelings for Vincent, he had little choice but to put the truth on the table. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Vince, but Winston's not the main force behind Catherine's disappearance. That honor belongs to your daddy." "Not you too, Corey," Vincent snapped. "It's documented fact. I learned it from Tanner, who's still very much alive, by the way." Vincent's eyes shot open. "Alive? Are you sure?" "I talked with him not more than an hour ago." "But what about the plane crash?" "There was no plane crash. It's more of your father's doing. Tanner has the evidence to prove it." Anger blazed from Vincent's eyes. "By evidence, are you referring to that computer disk and those splotches of blood that supposedly came from Father's office?" "Tanner used DNA to prove the blood was Brandon's, and on the disk, he found irrefutable evidence involving your father. I know how much you love your father, but the facts speak for themselves." "Who else knows about this?" Vincent asked sharply. "As far as I know, I'm the only one other than Tanner." Vincent rubbed his eyes. "Where is Tanner?" he asked. "I'm not exactly sure, and neither was he. It seems two of your father's men broke into his lab and drugged him the same way they drugged you and Catherine. They took him to a small island he assumed was somewhere off the coast of Mexico." "Conrad and Franco," Vincent angrily vented. "It had to be them." "Well, you won't have to worry about those two anymore. Tanner turned the tables on them." "They're dead?" "That's what he said." "The island," Vincent continued. "Tell me more about it." "Not much to tell. Tanner described it as small and uninhabited, and there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet. Tanner found Brandon's body." Vincent stepped from the car and took several deep breaths. What he said next caught Corey by complete surprise. "I may know where the island is, Corey. I lost a logbook some time back, and I suspected Winston might have found it, since it would be just like Winston to hide the book until he felt bringing it to light might serve some useful purpose in his conniving little mind. Winston is good at that sort of thing. Anyway, I let myself into his office and searched his desk. I found the logbook and noticed a map lying next to it. It was a map of the coast off Mexico, and someone had circled a small island several miles offshore. The map struck me as odd, since as far as I knew, Wagner Aerospace had no connection with any such island. I figured Winston had personal reasons for pinpointing it on the map, and if he was using company time and resources for something personal, I reasoned that knowing about the map might give me some ammunition if and when he ever tried to pull one of his shenanigans on me again. I made a copy of the map. It's in my desk back at the hangar." Vincent dug a set of keys out of his pocket. "Here," he said, handing them to Corey. "We'll take my car. It's faster. But you'll have to drive. To Falcon Field as fast as you can get us there."
This concludes CD number 3. To continue listening, insert CD number 4.